Hello, Honors. This review video goes over two of our poetry selections from our unit number 6, Dover Beach and Escape from the Old Country. In Matthew Arnold's poem Dover Beach, the speaker describes the experience of standing by the seaside. He says that life's misery ebbs and flows. He says he is losing his faith, though, and he encourages his love to stay true to him. He says life has no joy, love, light, or peace. So in Dover Beach, we have a Victorian poem that actually reads much more like a 20th century poem, especially that 1900 to about 1940 attitude that we get with the World War period. So let's take a look at Dover Beach first, because this is an extremely famous poem. Some people consider this a precursor to modern poetry. Now, Matthew Arnold lived from 1822 to 1888, so he definitely was a Victorian man. He lived all through the Victorian period. But his sentiments are much more like a modern poet, and the way he wrote is much more like a modern poet. We tend to think of the Victorians as a people, and this is a stereotype, but the literature often bears it out with the poetry of Alfred, Lord Tennyson, who is the most famous Victorian poet. Very gentlemanly, very, I'm not going to say unemotional, but I'll say level-headed. A poetry that is full of faith. And Arnold just turns that on its head. He completely changes the tone of what we think of as Victorian poetry. Some people call this a perfect poem. I don't know if I've ever seen a perfect poem or not, but it is a very well-balanced poem. Every stanza is a different poetic element. So let's take a look at it. We start out with what would be very common in the Romantic age with a nature image. Here he is with his wife. Your book has a very beautiful picture of the white cliffs of Dover. Dover is that part of southeastern England right across the English Channel from the country of France. And so he says, the sea is calm tonight. The tide is full. The moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand glimmering and vast out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window. Sweet is the night air. Now, when we do poetic analysis, we tend not to say that the speaker of the poem is the author, but a lot of times the poems are autobiographical. And Arnold and his wife actually did have a beach house there on Dover Beach, and occasionally could look across the channel and see the lights on the French coast. And he addresses that in the poem as well. So first we have the nature image where the sea is calm, the tide is full, the moon is out. He can see the white cliffs of Dover, obviously reflected, that chalky material reflected in the moonlight. And he calls his loved one over to the window. He says, sweet is the night air. Only from the long line of spray, where the sea meets the moon-blanched land, listen. You hear the grating roar of pebbles, which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand, begin and cease, and then again begin, with tremulous cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Well, we've gone from a nature image in the first stanza to an emotional feeling in the second stanza. That was also very common in Romantic era poetry. So Romanticism really did not die just because the Victorian age came along, or even because the modern age came along. Many of those same ideas and themes and things we'd gotten used to in the Romantic era continued into other time periods as well. So as he listens to the waves come back and forth, the ebb and the flow of the tide, the little pebbles which are sucked up on the beach and then drawn back out into the water again, his feeling was sadness. Now, why was he sad? What made him feel that way simply listening to the ebb and the flow of the tide? Well, if you know a lot about poetry, and you've read a lot of poetry, you know that the ebb and the flow of the tide are often in poetry symbols of life and death. Life comes in its fullness, and then eventually it will go out in its death. And so maybe that's what he started thinking about, because he brings us in our third stanza to a literary allusion. Sophocles, the ancient Greek writer. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound of thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. So here he is at home, and yet as he thinks about nature and as he looks at nature, it starts reminding him of all kinds of things, of emotions, of things that he's read. And Sophocles, of course, was not on the English Channel. Sophocles was on the Aegean, that upper part of the Mediterranean. And when Sophocles wrote about the same thing, the ebb and the flow of the tide, he thought about human misery and how good times come and good times go. Well, as a poet, poets are used to thinking of things symbolically. And so in the next stanza, we apply a symbolic meaning to the sea itself, the sea of faith. Now here he means traditional Christian faith. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. So as far as coming in, going out, that image of the ebb and the flow of the tide, he thinks about faith, religious faith, and how once upon a time to him, people had a lot of faith. Everybody believed in God. But in his own time, he's seeing people start to doubt those ideas. And so he says the sea of faith was once full, but it seems like it's just retreating and going down, 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 down. Well, he can't do anything about that. He can't solve that kind of problem. But what he can do is maintain a personal faithfulness with his wife. And so he says, "Oh, love, let us be true to one another. For the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night." So the faithfulness that he comes up with is more of a personal faithfulness, a one-on-one, person-to-person, husband to wife in this case, faithfulness. Let us be true to one another. Because he said the world seems to be lovely, but it's pretty stinky sometimes. And he says it doesn't have joy really, or love, or light, or certitude, or peace, or help for pain. Now you may think he's a pretty pessimistic fellow. And at this point in his life, maybe he really was a pessimistic person. He wasn't sure maybe what that new century everybody's talking about is going to hold. And so it's a little bit of a downer here at the end of the poem, isn't it? He says, we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. The old traditional battles that went on through the night, you couldn't see who you were fighting. You might be hacking at your best friend. You had no idea. Remember in our King Arthur story, that's the way it was at the end of the Arthurian legend. When Arthur was fighting the Battle of Malden with his son Mordred, and he couldn't even see who he was fighting. It was so dark. It was just every man for himself. And some people may say that's a good commentary, a negative commentary, but an accurate commentary on the modern age. Every person for himself. It's a selfish way to live. But Matthew Arnold thought about that there at home as he simply listened to a nature image. That's what it reminded him of, and that's a commentary he has about his own people. The other poem that we have in this collection is by Adrienne Sue, who was raised in Atlanta, Georgia. She graduated from Radcliffe and at Harvard University and received a Master of Fine Arts from the University of Virginia. And she has published a few books of poetry. Now, Escape from the Old Country, your book tells you in the author intro here, is a poem from Sue's collection called Sanctuary, published in 2006. It is about being the child of parents who immigrated to the United States from China. Like much of Sue's work, the poem illuminates what it means to be a member of a community, whether that's a family, a neighborhood, or an ethnic group. So her poem, Escape from the Old Country, explains that the speaker is native-born, but still held in the grip of her heritage. She describes living in suburban America, but still feeling the pangs of isolation. She seems different from everyone around her, and she's conscious of that. She says even those who were not born in the old country still feel tied to it, because, of course, of a person's heritage, of traditions and customs. So let's take a look at the poem Escape from the Old Country. I never had to make one. No sickening weeks by ocean, no waiting for the aerograms that gradually cease to come. She uses the pronoun without using the antecedent, but she knows, you know what she's talking about. I never had to make an ocean voyage, she's saying. Spent the babysitting money on novels, shoes, and movies. Yet the neighborhood stayed empty. It had nothing to do with the journey not undertaken, not with dialect, nor the land that waited to be rediscovered then rejected. As acid rain collected above the suburban hills, I tried to imagine being nothing. Tried to be able to claim, I have no culture, and be believed. Yet, the land occupies the person, even as the semblance of freedom invites a kind of recklessness. Tradition, unobserved, unasked, hangs on tight. Ancestors roam into reverie, interfering at the most awkward moments. First flirtations, in doorways and dressing rooms. But, of course, here in America, no one escapes. In the end, each traveler returns to the town where everyone knew she hadn't even been born. So there, in a very gentle way, our poet is describing how one's heritage, even though one's not part of that heritage, even though one might be born in another country, the heritage still comes through. And you really can't escape those ghosts. The past does interfere with the present. Sometimes we welcome it, sometimes we might not welcome it. But that uneasy feeling that she has there, that ambiguity that she has, as she juxtaposes her life here in America with her parents' traditions coming from China, trying to meld together as a new person. But is she more Chinese? Is she more American? She feels more American. But the other voices and the other customs, they come through too. And she can't neglect those. And so she says, each traveler, each one of us, returns. Maybe not literally, maybe figuratively, but still returns to the town where everyone knew she hadn't even been born. So that heritage is definitely a part of home, whether or not you've even been to where the ancestors came from. Part of that is part of you. It's like our language. I mean, here we are in America, in Lincoln County, Tennessee, and yet our language is made up of Anglo-Saxons that came from what we call Germany and Denmark, Vikings that came from Norway and Sweden, French people from Normandy, France. All of that makes up the way you and I talk. And so that's part of our linguistic heritage that we don't get away from because that's what's been left to us. But nothing original, always borrowed. But that's the human race, and that's how we all are. Let's take a quick look at our comprehension check questions on these two poems. They're combined with Seafarer on page 753, but we'll just take a look at Dover Beach and Escape from the Old Country. So for Dover Beach, number one, as the poem begins, what scene does the speaker describe? The speaker describes a view of the sea and the beach as seen through a window. For the speaker, what sound seems to have an eternal sadness? The sound of the surf coming in and retreating has an eternal sadness. In the final stanza, what does the speaker say the world lacks? Lacks joy, love, light, certitude or certainty, peace, and help for pain. And then the questions Escape from the Old Country. What type of journey has the speaker never had to take? A journey from one country to another to settle. 2, what does the speaker try to imagine being? She tries to imagine being nothing, someone without a culture, but she can't. According to the speaker, what does tradition do? Tradition just hangs on tight, whether one wants it to or not. Have a good day.